Imagine a country that ranks among the richest on Earth, with world-famous fjords, sky-high trust in its institutions, and a welfare state most nations envy. Now imagine that country being offered a seat at Europe's biggest table, shared markets, shared clout, a bigger voice in world affairs, and politely saying no. Not once, but twice. Why would a modern, globally connected nation decide to stay outside the European Union when nearly all of its neighbors joined? Today, we're telling that story. This is why Norway said no to the EU twice, and why that decision still makes sense to many Norwegians today. Let's begin with the scene. Two national referendums. The first took place in the early 1970s when the European project was still the European communities. The second came in the mid-1990s when the EU had grown in scope and ambition. In both votes, the no side won by a narrow margin. That matters. These weren't overwhelming rejections. They were close calls, decided by arguments that cut down to the daily lives of fishers, farmers, oil workers, small communities, and people who prize the way Norwegian democracy works. And yet here's the twist. Even as Norway remained outside the EU, it stayed deeply inside Europe, through the European Economic Area, through Schengen, through dense trade, and through shared standards. Norway chose proximity without membership, cooperation without a capital E, Europe carved into its constitution. Why? Reason 1. Fish first. In Norway, fishing is not just an industry. It's identity, heritage, and lifeblood for entire coastal regions. Imagine dawn in a northern village, boats heading out, weather turning on a dime, generations of knowledge passed from parent to child. The rules that decide who can fish what, where, and when are not abstract policy debates. They decide if a harbor thrives or fades. The European Union's Common Fisheries Policy promised access, but it also meant sharing control of quotas with a larger bloc. In communities where every catch matters, that felt risky. Many feared that joining the EU would dilute Norway's ability to protect its fish stocks and prioritize its coastal people. The argument wasn't anti-Europe, it was pro-fjord, pro-community, and fiercely protective of a resource seen as both fragile and foundational. Better to keep our hand on the tiller, many said, than to let someone else steer our boats. Reason 2. Farmers and the fjord economy. Norwegian agriculture is small-scale, rugged, and adapted to tricky terrain and a tough climate. The country supports this with subsidies and policies designed to keep rural communities alive. Because in Norway, agriculture is about more than output. It's about settlement patterns, culture, and food security in a land where winter is real and mountains are everywhere. The EU's Common Agricultural Policy is generous, but it is also continental, with rules negotiated for a mosaic of countries and climates. Many Norwegians worried that EU membership would pressure small farms, reshape subsidy systems, and pull the ground out from under delicate rural economies. They feared a slow drift toward fewer, larger farms, toward market logics that don't see the village, the valley, or the avalanche-prone road, only the spreadsheet. The no camp argued that staying out preserved the right to tailor support to the realities of Norway's land and people. Keep the ability to nurture communities that otherwise risked thinning out. Reason 3. Oil, gas, and energy sovereignty. Norway's modern story cannot be told without the North Sea. The discovery and careful management of petroleum resources helped build the savings that fund today's pensions and public services. The national conversation has long been about balance, how to tax and regulate, how to pace extraction, how to invest for future generations, how to manage the transition to cleaner energy while protecting jobs and competence. For many voters, staying outside the EU kept the steering wheel squarely in Norwegian hands. License terms, taxation, environmental standards, and the tempo of change felt too important to delegate to a larger table. It wasn't that Brussels was seen as hostile, it was that the stakes were existential. When your national savings, your energy mix, and your industrial strategy depend on the decisions you make today, you think hard before you share those decisions with 20+ other countries. The no sentiment was simple. Let's keep control of the resource that built the modern welfare state while we plan the next chapter. Reason 4. Democratic distance and the Norwegian way of doing politics. Norway is a high-trust country that leans on consensus, open committees, and a style of negotiation that often brings unions, employers, experts, and politicians around the same table. There is pride in how laws are made, close to the people, transparent, and attentive to the country's scale and culture. EU membership would mean accepting a considerable flow of rules from institutions where Norway would have a voice only as a member state among many, and where many decisions are made in systems and councils that feel far away. For some, the core issue wasn't any single law. It was the fear that lawmaking would move further from local hearings, municipal pragmatism, and the national parliament's hands-on style. The question echoed again and again: why trade a model that works for one that might work, but with less direct control? In a high-functioning democracy, even a small loss of voice can feel big. Reason 5. The EEA deal that felt like the best of both worlds. This might be the most Norwegian reason of all. Norway did not slam the European door shut. Instead, it opened it wide enough for trade, standards, and mobility to flow in and out. Through the European Economic Area, Norway gets access to the single market: goods, services, capital, and people. It aligns with a vast amount of European law to keep that access. Add in Schengen, and border checks fall away. The result is a highly integrated, practical relationship. To many voters, the EEA was proof that you could get the economic benefits without signing up to every political obligation of full membership. Yes, it means adopting rules you don't fully vote on. Yes, there is a cost in formal influence, but the perceived deal, market in, politics out, was good enough for the no side to say, why risk more? If a stable bridge already connects you to the shore, do you really need to buy the island? Reason 6. Center versus periphery, or Oslo versus the outports. The maps from both referendums tell a story. Urban areas, university towns, and places plugged tightly into continental networks often lean toward yes. Smaller communities, especially along the coasts and in the north, leaned no. Not out of narrowness, but out of lived experience. People voted their realities. If your livelihood turns on a quota, a milk price, a ferry route, or the presence of a local processing plant, you weigh European integration in those terms. That doesn't make you anti-European. It makes you pro-home. The emotional center of gravity in both campaigns was not abstract sovereignty or grand visions of Europe. It was whether the EU would protect or unsettle the corner of Norway where your children and neighbors live. In a place where distance and weather shape life, the periphery has a voice, and it used it. Reason 7. Risk aversion inside a system that already works. Norway's social model is coordinated, predictable, and built on trust. Unions and employers negotiate. The state plans long-term. The oil fund provides a cushion. Public services work. When a system delivers stability and high living standards, the burden of proof for big constitutional changes is heavy. Joining the EU for many felt like a leap into a larger, faster river. It promised opportunities, but it also introduced turbulence. Would decisions made for a continent fit Norway's size and shape? Would the balance between market dynamism and social protection shift? When the present is good, the future has to be convincingly better to justify a jump. Enough people, both times, weren't convinced. They chose the known path, not out of fear, but out of a preference for stewardship and continuity. So why did Norway say no twice? Because the core anxieties that decided the first vote never went away. Fish, farms, and democratic control still mattered just as much the second time. And because by the time the second referendum arrived, the EEA had given Norway a workable alternative to full membership, access without the full political commitment. That blunted the urgency to join. The European project itself had also changed. It was bigger, more ambitious, and more complex. For Norwegians who prized a steady hand on national levers, that made membership feel like a bigger step than before. Now, to be fair, many smart people make the case for membership. They argue that Norway already adopts a large share of EU rules through the EEA, so why not sit at the table where those rules are shaped? They point to research funding, innovation ecosystems, and coordinated responses to security threats that benefit full members. They note that influence matters, especially when you're already so aligned in practice. These are real arguments, and they resonate in cities, in boardrooms, and among people who spend their days solving cross-border problems. They say, we are already part of Europe, we should act like it. But the trade-offs run both ways. Accepting a seat at the table also means accepting votes where your preference loses and living with outcomes shaped by larger countries with different needs. It means pulling some levers less firmly at home. And while Norway can already cooperate closely on security and climate outside membership, joining would formalize commitments that some prefer to keep flexible. The no side can point to decades of prosperity and relative harmony under the EEA as proof that the current arrangement works. If rules are coming anyway, they say, we can manage them through adaptation and diplomacy without binding ourselves to every political project Europe undertakes. What about today? The world has changed since the second referendum. Europe faces new security realities. Energy systems are in transition. Climate targets sharpen. Supply chains move. In moments like these, countries often ask whether their old arrangements still fit. In Norway, the conversation continues. Sentiment rises and falls with events, but the bedrock reasons for caution remain surprisingly stable. Coastal communities still want to protect fish. Rural areas still want tailor-made farm policies. Policymakers still cherish the ability to fine-tune energy and industrial strategy at home. And the EEA still delivers market access in a way many voters understand and trust. You can be deeply European in practice without wearing the EU badge on your blazer. Take one final step back and you see a pattern. Norway's choice is not anti-European. It is a very Norwegian version of Europeanness. Pragmatic, incremental, fond of bridges, skeptical of leaps. A country used to hard weather and long winters values systems that can withstand storms. It prefers to test the ice before crossing the river. Twice, Norwegians tapped the ice with their poles, looked across at a fast-moving current, nodded to their neighbors and said, "Not today." They set up a reliable ferry instead. Here is the heart of it, in one breath. Norway said no to the EU twice because fish, farms, and energy felt safer under national control, because democracy felt closer to the ground at home, because the EEA offered economic gains without full political union, because the coast and the countryside spoke loudly, and because a stable, high-performing model made caution the rational choice. That is not a rejection of Europe. It is a decision about how to live with Europe. If you lived in Norway and a third vote came tomorrow, which reason would sway you? Would you want a louder voice shaping European rules from inside? Or would you choose to keep the current balance? Close cooperation, national levers, and a bridge that's already proven itself in rough seas. Think about the harbor you care about, the farm road you drive, the energy bills you pay, and the schools your children attend. Where should the decisions that shape those things be made? At a table of 20+ or at home with Brussels just a phone call away. Thank you for watching. If this helped you understand Norway's unusual but thoughtful choice, consider subscribing for more clear, story-driven explainers on how small countries make big decisions. Share this with a friend who loves Scandinavian politics, and tell us in the comments which of the 7 reasons you find most convincing or which one you think will matter most in the years ahead.